In this video, we're going to create our project, set up our environment, as well as our shaders. So let's get started by creating the project. Here at the top of the UI, we're going to go to File, New, and this is going to open up the New Project dialog. Now for the template, I want to make sure that I choose PBR Metallic Roughness. So I'm choosing that here from the drop-down menu. And for the mesh, now we need to load a mesh. So I'm going to click the Select button. And if you're following along here in the project files, you can load lantern.fbx. So we'll click Open. Now, this mesh does not have UDIM tile, so I'm going to leave this Create Texture Set per UDIM tile. I'm going to leave this unchecked. Now, for the normal format, I'm going to leave this at the default DirectX. Now, this next option, Compute Tangent Space per Fragment, is specific to if you're baking a normal map that's going to be used in Unreal Engine. So we're not going to worry about that. We'll leave that unchecked. And then here for the document resolution, I'm going to start with a base 2K. Now, we can change this resolution at any time. So with all this set up, I'm going to click OK, and Substance Painter is going to create my project. Alright, so now we have our project, and what you're seeing here is the default UI of Substance Painter. Now, the UI is customizable, so I can take these views and move them as I like, but what I'm going to do is actually close each one of these views. And as I do this, you can see that the view then becomes docked here on the far right, which is the area that we refer to as the dock. So I'm just going to close all of these views and just dock them. So this is going to leave us with a very simplistic UI. We have all the views docked, and when we need to access a view, we can simply just click the button to show the view. Now this is also going to provide us with a simplistic way to experience Substance Painter as we walk through this Getting Started course. We're only going to look at the views as we actually need them. So for now, I'm just going to close this view, and like I said, here we have this very large 3D view. By default, the Substance Painter viewport is using a classic Maya navigation. So if I hold down the Alt key and the left mouse button, I can orbit the view. Using the Alt key and the right mouse button, I can zoom in and out. And using the Alt key and the middle mouse button, I can pan. Now we can change this navigation behavior if I come here to the Edit menu and go to Settings. Here in the keyboard shortcuts, I'll scroll down to where we see the camera navigation, and here you can see that we have camera translate, camera zoom, and camera rotate, and you can change this to match the keyboard shortcuts that you would like to use, or whatever you're most comfortable with. So I'm just going to leave it here at the default, and I'll click cancel here. Now, the viewport's actually lit by an HDR environment, and that is how lighting works here in Substance Painter. And I can rotate this environment. Now, a keyboard shortcut is to hold down the Shift key and the right mouse button left to right, and I can rotate this environment. Now we're going to want to set up our environment. So here over in the dock, I'm going to open up the display settings. Now this is getting cut off here in the screen capture, but this icon here says display settings. So I'm going to click this view, and here you can see that I have 3 tabs. We have the environment tab. If I click this tab button here, it takes me to the camera settings. And then if I click this button here, it's going to take me here to my viewport settings. So here we'll go back to our environment settings, and you can see here that I have this environment map, which is set to panorama. If I click this button, this is going to open up what we refer to as the mini shelf. It's using the environment tag, and then I can choose a different environment. Here I'm going to set the opacity all the way to 100, and I'm going to decrease the environment blur. So now we can actually see the background. So here I'm going to hold down the Shift key and the right mouse button once more and start to rotate. And here again, we can see how that environment is rotating. We also have this slider control here. Now again, like I said, if I want to change this environment, I can click the button and just browse for something else. So for example, I might choose this evening meadow, and now I have a different lighting setup. I can also come over here to the shadow section and enable shadowing. So here again, I'm just going to rotate my environment using the keyboard shortcut. And here, let's go back and just switch this to the default panorama. So I'm going to disable my shadows for now. And I'm also going to take my opacity and just set this all the way to 0. Now I'd mentioned before, for this environment map, we have this mini shelf. Now we have a full shelf here, so if I come back to my dock, I'm going to click this shelf button, and here we have this full shelf. Now this contains all of the assets that ship with Substance Painter. For example, here I'm looking at materials. Here's another category for the environments. I'm going to switch this view mode here to large, and then if we mouse over these images, we're going to get a thumbnail of the types of environments that we can use. So as a workflow example, let's say that I could undock my shelf, so it's going to land here in the UI. Then I might go back here to my environment settings, And then I could simply take one of these environments, left click, and drag and drop it right over top of the button, and that's going to apply this new environment. So here, let's take our opacity all the way up to 100, and now we can see this new environment. So again, just another way to work. Like I said though, I'm just going to leave this at the panorama, and I'll close my display settings, and here in this case, I'm just going to also just dock the shelf back here to the dock panel. Also, I did want to make sure that I set that opacity down to 0, so let's set that to 0. Next, let's talk about setting up our shaders. So here in the dock, I'm going to click this option here, which is called Texture Set List. And the Texture Set List shows all of the texture sets for my Painter project. Now, a texture set in Substance Painter is just a material ID that you set in your 3D program. For example, here in Maya, you can see that I have the lantern. Here I have a set of these materials. So for example, we have top 1. If I were to select this, you can see that the top 1 material selects this portion here of the mesh. When this FBX is exported with these materials assigned, Substance Painter will then create a texture set for each one of these materials. So again, here in Substance Painter, you can see that I have this top 1 texture set, and if I solo this, here you can see the area of the mesh in which that material was applied. So as you can see, we can navigate these texture sets by simply clicking on them. You can also use a keyboard shortcut for doing this as well. So for example, if I hold down the Control-Alt key and right-click on an area of the mesh, it will automatically select the texture set, as you can see here in the texture set list. This gives us a really quick way to work, and also means that we don't need this texture set list available all the time. We can just simply control right mouse button over an area to select the texture set. So for now, I'm going to undock this texture set list, so it's going to appear here in my UI. Now each texture set contains its own settings as well as its own layers. So for example, if we take a look here at the layers, and what I'm going to do here is just dock this. Now here you can see that we have a texture set list. We're looking at top 1. Let's just solo this. This texture set is going to have its own layer stack that's associated with it. It's also going to have its own set of texture set settings, which you can find here in the dock under texture set settings. Now, if we take a look at these texture sets, you can see that there's a drop down here and they all say main shader. That means that each one of these texture sets is using the exact same shader. Well, in our case, and let me just unsolo everything, we have this glass texture set. And what I'd like to do is use a transparency shader to represent this glass here in my Substance Painter viewport. So what I'm going to do is come over here to this drop down and I'm going to choose New Shader Instance. Now you'll notice that for this glass, this says Main Shader Copy. So this means we now have a new shader representing this glass texture set, which is going to be separate than the other texture sets here in my list. So as I said earlier, all texture sets have their own settings. So let's go and edit the settings for this glass texture set. So here again, I'm going to click the texture set settings. And you can see that for this texture set, it is comprised of a resolution. It's also comprised of the channels that make up the inputs to the shader we chose. In our case, we were working with metallic roughness. So we have base color, rough, and metal. Here we also have a set of baked mesh maps, which we'll cover in a later video. But what I want to do for now is I want to add an opacity channel that I can work with here in this texture set settings. So here for the channels, I'm going to click this plus button. Now it's getting cut off here in the UI. So what I'm going to do is just take this bar here at the top and I'm just going to left click and drag to just break that off. So now I'll click the plus button again. And here you can see that we have this opacity input. So I'm going to choose this and this creates a new opacity to be used by a shader. Next, we're going to set up that shader. So let's close our texture set settings here, and let's go over here to the shader settings. So here I'll click the shader settings. Again, you can see that we have our glass texture set selected. This main shader copy is set because we created a new shader instance. And here for the instance name, we have main shader copy. Now I'm just going to change this to something that makes more sense, like glass. So now we're going to change the name of this shader to be glass. So now what we want to do is we want to change this shader, which by default is going to be this PBR metal rough. So I'm just going to click this button here. It's going to open up that mini shelf and I'm going to choose a different shader. This time here I'm going to choose the PBR metal rough with alpha blending. So I'll select this shader and now the glass is going to have a different shader. So for example, if I go and click on another texture set, let's say this arm handle, you can see that its shader is still set to that default PBR metal rough, whereas our glass has now been changed to use a different shader. So at this stage, we've created a new shader, we've assigned that new shader here to our specific glass texture set, and within this texture set, we've added a new opacity channel. Now all we need to do is add a layer in the layer stack for this glass texture set that works with opacity. So we're going to do that now. So here with the glass selected, I already have my layers view open. So what I'm going to do is come over to here and I'm going to create here what we call a fill layer. So I'm going to create a fill layer and I'm going to name this, I'm just going to call it opacity. Now a fill layer is just a container for all the channels that represent our texture set. So again, if we take a look here at our texture set settings, that fill layer is going to give us access to our base color, height, rough, metal, normal, and opacity. All of the channels that are a part of our texture set settings. And we can fill those channels with some type of data, whether it be a uniform color or a texture, and so on. So here, I'm just going to close out this view. And now we want to edit our properties. So here I'm going to click my properties button, which is the properties fill. So I'll click this, and this properties is going to be context sensitive based on what I have selected in the UI. So for example, here I have a fill layer, so it's going to show me my fill layer properties. And if I click this material tab, this is going to take me straight to my material. You'll notice here that I have all of the channels enabled from my texture set. Now in my case here, I'm going to disable all of my channels except for just my opacity. And then I'm going to come over here to this slider and just drag this down closer to a value of black. Here in the viewport, you can see that we're starting to introduce some transparency here to our glass. Now right now I'm doing a lot of opening and closing panels, and I'm doing that just to try to keep things focused on one item at a time. But of course we could drag this off here and dock it somewhere in the UI so that it's always available to us. Another way that we could work with this is, let's say that I have my layer stack open like this. I can also just right click here in the UI to open up our quick view. And the quick view is also context sensitive based on what we have selected here in our UI. So for example, Painter knows that we have a fill layer selected. So this quick view is going to give me the properties for the fill layer. So here if I select my material tab again, I have the same exact controls. And I can just get to this really quickly, set the value that I want, and then just left click to close that view. Okay, so at this stage, we talked about creating our project. We also discussed how a texture set represents material IDs that you export from your 3D program. We also looked at the process of creating a shader here for our glass texture set. And then finally adding an opacity fill layer and lowering the transparency to mimic the look of glass here in the Painter real-time viewport. Later in the course, we will actually set refraction settings for this glass shader once we start to render in Iray. So that's going to close out this video, and in the next video, we're going to take a look at baking the textures that we need to help us in our texturing process.